Marcus Williams had been wrestling 18-wheelers across the country for over 23 years. In that time, the highway had become more of a home to him than any brick-and-mortar building ever could. He was a man carved from the very grit of the American road system, practical, level-headed, and utterly immune to the supernatural nonsense that some of the younger drivers chattered about over their CB radios during the long, lonely nights. He'd hauled freight through blizzards that turned interstates into lethal ice rinks, navigated Colorado mountain passes where one wrong move meant a 1,000-foot plunge into oblivion, and driven through city neighborhoods where stopping at a red light was an open invitation to disaster. In short, Marcus was not the type of man who spooked easily. That particular October evening found him hauling a precious load of next-generation electronics from a secure facility in California to a distribution hub in Chicago. He was running slightly behind schedule, a fact that gnawed at him like a persistent hunger. An unexpected delay at a way station in Utah had cost him a few precious hours, and the cargo was valuable and time-sensitive, bound by a delivery window as rigid and unforgiving as steel. He had been pushing his rig for nearly 11 hours, the legal limit looming in his logbook, but he was determined to make it to the next major truck stop. Pulling over at one of the small, desolate rest areas that dotted this particular stretch of Interstate 80 inches, Nebraska felt like admitting defeat. The landscape around him was a vast, inky canvas of nothingness. Endless cornfields, harvested and skeletal under the autumn moon, stretched to a horizon that felt infinitely distant. The only lights were the far-off, pinprick glows from farmhouse porches, looking like lonely, forgotten stars in the terrestrial darkness. It was approaching 2 in the morning, a time when the world felt hollowed out, when the road belonged only to the sleepless and the lost. It was then that he saw the flashing lights in his side mirror. At first, Marcus felt a familiar, dull annoyance. He assumed it was a state trooper pulling over some other unfortunate soul. But the lights grew brighter, more insistent, their strobing red and blue beams painting the inside of his cab with frantic, silent urgency. They were for him. A patrol car, sleek and dark, pulled alongside his cab, and the silhouette of an officer gestured for him to pull over. Marcus instinctively checked his speedometer. He was traveling at the exact posted speed limit. His logbook was immaculate, his inspection certificates were up to date, and his cargo was perfectly secured. Still, roadside inspections were an unavoidable part of the business, and arguing with law enforcement on a deserted highway was a fool's errand. With a resigned sigh, Marcus guided his massive rig onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching under the immense weight. He activated his hazard lights, their rhythmic ticking suddenly deafening in the quiet cab. The patrol car pulled in behind him, and as its headlights illuminated his mirrors, something struck Marcus as odd. The vehicle looked official, but it was subtly wrong. It had the standard light bar and what appeared to be government plates. But the paint scheme wasn't quite right for the Nebraska State Patrol. The colors seemed a shade off, darker, and the decals, the state seal and official lettering appeared to be placed in unusual, almost haphazard positions. Marcus had been stopped in dozens of states over his career. He prided himself on recognizing the different agency vehicles. This one, however, didn't match any he could recall. The officer who approached his cab was a tall man, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing what looked like a standard Department of Transportation inspection uniform. His badge glinted, catching the light from Marcus's own headlights. He carried a clipboard and a digital inspection device that looked perfectly authentic. But when the man spoke, his voice had a strange, resonant quality, as if it were echoing slightly in a vast, empty chamber rather than being spoken on an open highway. "Good evening, driver," the man said, his tone flat and devoid of warmth. "I am Inspector Thompson with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. I need to conduct a routine Level 1 inspection of your vehicle and cargo documentation." The statement was professional, by the book. Yet, an inexplicable sense of dread began to coil in Marcus's stomach. There was something profoundly unsettling about the inspector's demeanor. His eyes, dark and deep-set, seemed to reflect the light in an unnatural way, like polished obsidian. And when he offered a brief, thin-lipped smile, his teeth appeared unnaturally white and perfectly, unnervingly straight. Marcus, ever the professional, complied. He handed over his commercial driver's license, his medical certificate, and his logbook through the window. Inspector Thompson examined each document with an unnerving intensity, his gloved fingers tracing the lines of text as if he were reading something more than just the printed words, as if he were sensing the history of the paper itself. After several long minutes of profound silence, he looked up, and Marcus felt pinned by those strangely reflective eyes. "You are hauling electronics, correct?" the inspector stated, not asked. Specifically, laptop computers, tablets, and smartphone components bound for distribution centers in Illinois. The statement was chillingly accurate, but Marcus hadn't yet provided any information about his cargo. The bill of lading and shipping documents were sealed in an envelope in his sleeper berth. The trailer doors, secured with tamper-evident locks, had not been opened since he'd left the loading dock in California. How did you know that?" Marcus asked, his voice a little unsteady. "I haven't shown you the cargo manifest yet." Inspector Thompson's unsettling, perfect smile returned. "I know many things about your cargo, Marcus Williams of Tulsa, Oklahoma," he said, his voice dropping into that strange, resonant tone again. "I know you are transporting $470,000 worth of electronic devices. I know you are running 2 hours and 15 minutes behind your scheduled delivery time. And I know you have been divorced for 6 years, and that your ex-wife Rebecca still calls you every Thursday evening to discuss your daughter Sarah's college expenses." The air in the cab turned to ice. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. The cargo value was precise. The time delay was exact. But the personal information, that was impossible. It was a violation of the natural order of things. His ex-wife did call him every Thursday, a ritual of shared responsibility and lingering affection. Their conversations almost always centered on the ever-rising costs of their daughter's education. This was information that existed only in the private, sacred corners of his life. It was not contained in any government database a highway inspector could ever access. I think there has been some mistake," Marcus stammered, his hand instinctively moving toward his CB radio. His training screamed at him to call for assistance, to contact his dispatcher, to verify this bizarre and terrifying inspection. Before his fingers could even touch the microphone, Inspector Thompson's hand shot through the open window with inhuman speed. He grasped Marcus's wrist, and the grip was like a band of frozen steel. An unnatural cold, deep and penetrating, seeped into Marcus's bones, and he could feel a bizarre, static-like energy, a low hum, running from the man's fingers into his own body. "There is no mistake, Marcus." The inspector's voice was now deeper, more resonant, and his eyes seemed to have taken on a faint, internal glow of their own. "I have been waiting for you. Your cargo contains more than just electronics. There are items in trailer position 7 Alpha 3 that do not appear on your manifest, items that certain parties are very interested in acquiring." Marcus's mind raced in panic. He had loaded the trailer himself, supervising the entire process with meticulous care. Every pallet had been scanned, documented, and placed according to a precise schematic. The trailer had been sealed with locks that were, he knew, still intact. There was no position 7 Alpha 3 in his cargo configuration. There were no unmanifested items. "You're confused," Marcus managed to say, his voice trembling. "My cargo was loaded under direct supervision. Everything is accounted for." Inspector Thompson released his grip, and the sudden return of warmth to Marcus's wrist was almost as shocking as the cold had been. He stepped back from the truck and pulled a small, black device from his pocket. It looked like a fusion of a GPS tracker and a radio transmitter, utterly alien in its design. "This will monitor your progress for the remainder of your journey," the inspector said, his voice returning to its flat, official tone. "Do not attempt to remove it. Do not deviate from your planned route. When you reach your destination in Chicago, you will receive further instructions." Before Marcus could form a protest, Thompson reached out and attached the device to the underside of his driver's side mirror. It clung to the metal with some kind of powerful adhesive that bonded instantly, and the device immediately began to emit a soft, pulsing blue light and a barely audible, high-frequency hum. "What is that thing?" Marcus demanded, his voice a mixture of fear and outrage. "You can't attach unauthorized tracking devices to commercial vehicles." But Inspector Thompson was already walking back toward his patrol car, his movements fluid and unnervingly silent. "Safe travels, Marcus," he called over his shoulder, the words seeming to hang in the cold, night air. "Remember, I will be monitoring your progress." He climbed into his vehicle. The engine started not with a roar, but with a deep, guttural thrum that seemed too powerful, too elemental for a standard patrol car. As the vehicle pulled away, Marcus watched in stunned disbelief. Its headlights seemed to cast shadows in the wrong direction, and the red taillights didn't just move away, they left faint, bloody trails in the air, like streaks of paint on a black canvas. Then, within seconds, the vehicle was gone. It didn't speed down the highway in either direction. It simply vanished, as if it had been erased from existence. Marcus sat in his cab for what felt like an eternity, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried to process what had just happened. The device on his mirror continued its soft, rhythmic hum, its blue light pulsing like a malevolent heartbeat. He thought about prying it off, but the inspector's warning echoed in his mind, and a primal, instinctual fear told him that tampering with the device would be a catastrophic mistake. He finally put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. The world felt different now, tilted on its axis. The electronic systems in his truck began to behave erratically, almost immediately. His GPS display flickered, showing his correct location one moment and then flashing to places he had never been: a desolate street in Prague, a dusty road in Cairo, the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The radio, which he'd turned on for the comfort of a human voice, began picking up bizarre transmissions, snatches of conversations in languages he didn't recognize, haunting, discordant music, and what sounded like number stations from the Cold War. His CB radio, his lifeline, would occasionally crackle with what sounded like conversations between truckers he knew had been dead for years, their spectral voices discussing phantom road conditions and ghost-light truck stops. Every few miles, Marcus would catch a glimpse of the phantom patrol car in his mirrors. It was always there, maintaining the same precise distance, a dark predator in his wake. But whenever he looked over his shoulder or checked the road directly behind him, there was nothing but empty asphalt. The device continued to pulse and hum, and he began to notice that other vehicles on the highway gave him a wide berth. Cars would change lanes long before they got close to him, and other truckers seemed to avoid his proximity, as if they could sense the wrongness that now clung to his rig. By the time Marcus finally reached the delivery destination in Illinois, he had not slept for over 30 hours and was teetering on the brink of madness. The device had corrupted every electronic system in his truck. His electronic logbook, a device meant to enforce federal law, now showed a journey through impossible routes and recorded driving hours that stretched into days he had not yet lived. With trembling hands, he backed his trailer up to the loading dock. When he finally broke the seal and opened the trailer doors, he discovered that his perfectly arranged cargo had been shifted. The pallets were rearranged in a complex geometric pattern that, when viewed from above, spelled out a set of celestial coordinates. Marcus never saw Inspector Thompson again, but the device remained fused to his mirror for the rest of his driving career, a permanent reminder of his midnight inspection. He learned to live with the constant electronic disturbances, the ghost glimpses of vehicles that shouldn't exist, and the chilling whispers on the radio. He never spoke of the incident to other drivers, knowing they would dismiss it as highway hypnosis or sleep deprivation psychosis. It was his burden to carry alone. Years later, when Marcus finally retired from trucking, he sold his rig. On his last day, he stood before the truck and decided to try, one final time, to remove the device from the mirror. The moment his fingers touched its cool, smooth surface, he heard Inspector Thompson's voice as clearly as if the man were standing right beside him, whispering directly into his ear. Thank you for your service. Marcus Williams, your cargo has been delivered to its true destination. The device dissolved in his hands, turning into a puff of fine, gray dust that smelled faintly of ozone and burnt sugar. It left behind nothing but the memory of those unnaturally reflective eyes, watching him from the eternal, haunted darkness of America's highways. The doppelganger on Highway 50, ***, Daniel Torres, was a man who knew America by the seams of its asphalt. In his 15-year career as an owner-operator, he had driven every major highway in the continental United States, from the sun-scorched I-10 inches the south to the frozen I-90 corridor in the north. But there was one road he had always consciously avoided. U.S. Route 50, through the vast, empty heart of Nevada. It wasn't a rational avoidance, more of a professional superstition. He'd heard the whispers from other drivers, the strange tales that clung to that particular stretch of road like morning fog. They called it the loneliest road in America, and Daniel had always felt that some places earned their nicknames for reasons best left undiscovered. His hand was forced on a crisp October run. A massive chemical spill had shut down Interstate 80 indefinitely, a toxic wound bleeding across the highway for miles. His dispatcher, a pragmatic voice 1,000 miles away, offered him a choice: sit in a truck stop in Elko for potentially days, burning money and time, or take the detour. Take Highway 50. The additional fuel costs and the extra hours would eat into his profit margin, but Daniel prided himself on an almost fanatical devotion to his delivery deadlines. He had never missed one. He wasn't about to start now. Highway 50 stretched across the Nevada high desert like a ruler drawn by a god. It was a place of profound, almost aggressive emptiness. The road connected small, forgotten towns separated by dozens of miles of sagebrush, alkali flats, and distant, sleeping mountains that looked like the fossilized bones of colossal beasts. The road had earned its nickname honestly. For long, hypnotic stretches, Daniel would drive for an hour or more without seeing another soul, passing only the occasional rusted ranch gate or a historical marker, commemorating the pioneers who had crossed this same unforgiving terrain in covered wagons a century and a half before. He was hauling a load of expensive furniture from North Carolina to Sacramento, and despite the detour, he was running a day ahead of schedule. The October weather was perfect for driving clear, azure skies and mild temperatures that kept his engine running cool and his fuel economy high. He had filled his tanks to the brim in Ely and, after a quick calculation, figured he had just enough diesel to make it to Fallon without another stop, though he'd have to watch his consumption carefully on the long, grinding mountain passes. It was approaching midnight when Daniel first noticed the other truck. He was climbing a long, steep grade about 30 miles east of Austin, his engine groaning under the strain. The headlights appeared suddenly in his mirrors, a pair of bright, unwavering eyes materializing out of the immense blackness behind him. They maintained a steady, professional distance of perhaps a quarter mile. This was not unusual in itself. On lonely highways, truckers often fell into an unspoken, informal convoy, a silent pact for safety and companionship. They would use the CB radio to share information about road conditions, speed traps, or the best coffee at the next fuel stop. Daniel, feeling a small measure of relief at no longer being utterly alone, keyed his microphone. He switched to channel 19, the digital heartbeat of the American trucker. Eastbound truck, about a quarter mile behind the furniture hauler. He said, his voice calm and friendly. "You got your ears on?" He waited. The only response was the gentle hiss of static, a sound like the universe whispering to itself. Daniel shrugged it off. Some drivers preferred to travel in silence, lost in their own thoughts or the drone of their engine. He didn't think much of it. As he crested the grade and began the long, winding descent into the next valley, Daniel glanced in his mirrors again and felt the first faint twinge of unease. The truck following him, it appeared to be identical to his own rig. It was the same model of tractor, a Peterbilt 389. Same deep blue color scheme, a custom job he'd been so proud of. Same distinctive configuration of amber running lights along the cab and trailer. This was highly unusual, but not impossible. Many large trucking companies operated fleets of identical vehicles, and owner-operators sometimes gravitated toward popular models and colors. It was a coincidence. A strange one, but a coincidence nonetheless. What truly began to bother Daniel was the truck's behavior. It maintained its following distance with an impossible, robotic precision. When he accelerated on the downhill stretches, its headlights grew no closer and no farther. When he geared down and slowed for the sharp, hairpin curves, it slowed in perfect, mirrored time. When he activated his turn signal to move around a piece of blown-out tire on the road, the phantom truck's signals flashed in perfect, unnerving synchronization. A knot of anxiety tightened in his gut. He tried the CB radio again, his voice a little more forceful this time. "Hey, mirror truck. This is the furniture hauler. You're riding my tail pretty close there, partner. How about you back off a little bit?" Still nothing, only the indifferent hiss of static. He switched to channel 9, the emergency frequency, and then scanned several other common trucking channels. His radio was working perfectly. He could pick up distant, fragmented transmissions from other parts of Nevada, ghostly snippets of conversation about weather and way stations, but the truck directly behind him, his silent companion, remained utterly mute. As the night deepened, Daniel's unease curdled into a genuine, creeping dread. He decided to make a stop in the small town of Austin, hoping the other driver would simply pass by. As he pulled into the brightly lit truck stop, he watched his mirrors with obsessive focus. The phantom truck drove past the entrance without slowing, its identical form melting back into the absolute darkness beyond the reach of the parking lot lights. Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him. The other driver was just on his own schedule, headed for a different destination. The whole thing had been a strange, but ultimately harmless, coincidence. After refueling and taking his mandatory break, Daniel pulled back onto Highway 50. He took a deep breath of the cold, clean desert air, ready to put the strange encounter behind him. He merged onto the empty highway and immediately felt his heart plummet into his stomach. The headlights were back. They had appeared in his mirrors, as if from nowhere, instantly assuming the same precise, quarter-mile following distance as before. This time, Daniel knew something was profoundly wrong. He had been parked for over an hour. There had been no other trucks at the fuel stop. Where had this truck been? Had it been waiting for him, lurking somewhere in the darkness just off the highway? Panic began to fray the edges of his composure. He floored the accelerator, pushing his engine harder than he normally would, the roar echoing across the silent desert. The phantom truck matched his speed exactly, its headlights remaining a fixed point in his mirrors. He then slammed on the brakes, slowing to well below the posted limit. His follower did the same, a perfect, instantaneous echo of his own actions. In a fit of desperate experimentation, he activated his hazard lights. The phantom truck's hazards began to flash in perfect, maddening synchronization. Fear, cold and sharp, began to replace curiosity. Daniel realized he was dealing with something beyond the realm of normal explanation. He grabbed his cell phone, intending to call his dispatcher or even the highway patrol, but the screen showed no signal. This was an area where his carrier normally provided good coverage. The CB radio continued to function, but every frantic attempt to contact his pursuer was met with the same maddening, empty static. He decided to test his pursuer more aggressively. He saw a sign for a rest area near Cold Springs and pulled off the highway, watching his mirrors like a hawk. He reduced his speed, activated his turn signal. The phantom truck's signal flashed in response, but instead of following him into the rest area, it continued straight down the highway, its taillights shrinking until they were swallowed by the darkness. Daniel parked and, with a flashlight in his trembling hand, walked around his truck, his heart pounding. He checked for any device, any piece of equipment that might be broadcasting his location or transmitting his vehicle's actions to another rig. He found nothing. His truck was equipped with a standard GPS tracker for his insurance company and an electronic logging device, but neither system had the capability to account for the phantom truck's impossible mimicry. He waited at the rest area for 20 minutes, his nerves screaming. He hoped his follower would continue down the highway and leave him in peace. When he finally summoned the courage to pull back onto Highway 50, his heart sank. Within minutes, the familiar headlights reappeared in his mirrors. The phantom truck had been waiting for him again, somewhere out there in the crushing darkness, ready to resume its silent, relentless pursuit. Daniel tried a different, more frantic approach. He began making erratic lane changes, sudden and pointless variations in speed, and flashing his signals randomly. The phantom truck matched every single movement perfectly, as if it were connected to his vehicle by some invisible, unbreakable tether. When Daniel flashed his high beams, the phantom truck's lights flashed in response. When he tapped his brakes, causing his brake lights to flicker in a nervous rhythm, the exact same pattern appeared behind him. The situation became even more disturbing as he approached the summit of another mountain pass. In the crystal-clear desert air, he could see for miles. The highway ahead was a completely empty, black ribbon. There were no oncoming headlights, no taillights disappearing over distant hills, no signs of any other traffic for as far as the eye could see. Yet the phantom truck maintained its relentless pursuit, its headlights burning in his mirrors like the eyes of some vast, mechanical predator. Daniel tried to get a better look at his pursuer. He adjusted his mirrors, angling them just so, and turned on his cab's dome light to reduce the glare. What he saw made his blood freeze in his veins. The truck was not just similar to his, it was a perfect atom-for-atom duplicate of his own vehicle. It had the same cab configuration, the same trailer type, the same custom paint. He could even make out the same company decals on the door and the same DOT numbers stenciled on the side. It was as if someone had created a perfect, ghostly copy of his rig and was now using it to torment him on the loneliest road in America. As dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and lavender, Daniel was exhausted and terrified. He had been driving all night with his mysterious, silent companion, and his nerves were frayed to the breaking point. The phantom truck had never varied its distance, never attempted to pass, and never responded to his desperate attempts at communication. He decided to make one final, desperate test. He would stop his truck completely, right in the middle of the highway, and force his pursuer to reveal its intentions. Highway 50 was empty enough that he could safely block both lanes without endangering anyone. He began to reduce his speed gradually, watching the phantom truck slow in perfect response. When Daniel finally brought his massive rig to a complete stop in the center of the highway, the phantom truck stopped exactly a quarter-mile behind him. Both vehicles sat, motionless in the pre-dawn gloom, their engines idling in a synchronized hum, their headlights creating two lonely pools of light on the empty asphalt. Daniel grabbed a heavy maglite from his door pocket and climbed out of his cab, his boots crunching on the cold ground. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He began walking back toward the phantom truck, determined to confront whatever or whoever was driving it. As he walked, a new, impossible horror dawned on him. The distance between him and the other truck seemed to remain constant. It felt as if the phantom truck were backing away at the exact same speed he was walking forward. After what felt like 10 minutes of determined walking, Daniel realized he was no closer to the phantom truck than when he had started. Its headlights remained a fixed, mocking distance away, and his own truck was now just a dim glow far behind him. This was impossible. The road was straight as an arrow here. He should have covered the quarter-mile distance in a few minutes. Panic, pure and primal, finally overtook rational thought. Daniel turned and ran, sprinting back toward the safety of his own truck. As he ran, he could see the phantom truck's headlights in his peripheral vision, still maintaining their constant, impossible distance. When he finally reached his own truck, gasping for breath, and scrambled back into the cab, the phantom truck was still there in his mirrors, waiting patiently at its prescribed following distance. As the sun finally climbed over the Nevada mountains, Bathing the desert in the clear, sharp light of morning, Daniel noticed the phantom truck's headlights growing dimmer. As full daylight washed over the landscape, he could no longer see his mysterious pursuer in his mirrors. The highway behind him was completely, utterly empty, stretching back toward the mountains in an unbroken line of asphalt. Daniel completed his delivery in Sacramento on schedule, but he never forgot his night on the loneliest road in America. He researched Highway 50 obsessively, searching for stories from other drivers who had experienced similar encounters. He found them scattered reports dating back decades, all describing identical trucks that followed drivers through the Nevada desert before vanishing without a trace at dawn. Some researchers suggested the phantom trucks were mirages, optical illusions caused by the unique atmospheric conditions of the high desert. Others theorized they were hallucinations, brought on by the profound isolation and monotony of driving long distances through an empty, featureless country. Daniel knew what he had experienced was real. He never drove Highway 50 again. For years afterward, whenever other drivers asked him about routes through Nevada, he would always recommend Interstate 80, even if it meant longer distances and higher fuel costs. When they pressed him for an explanation, he would simply shake his head and say that some roads were meant to be traveled alone, and that Highway 50 had its own set of rules that living drivers were not meant to understand. The phantom truck never followed Daniel on other routes, but sometimes, on particularly dark nights, when he was driving through the most isolated parts of the country, he would catch a fleeting glimpse of identical headlights in his mirrors, maintaining that same precise, impossible distance, as if waiting for him to one day return to the loneliest road in America. Maria Santos was a familiar and welcome voice on the airwaves of the southeastern United States. In her 9 years of driving commercial trucks, she had cultivated a reputation for calm professionalism and reliable communication. She was a constant presence on the CB radio, a friendly voice that shared timely information about traffic conditions, weather hazards, and law enforcement activity. Dozens of regular drivers who traveled the same routes knew her by her handle, Savannah Star, and they relied on her as a helpful, steady presence on the long, dark stretches of highway. That particular January evening, Maria was hauling a load of textiles from Charlotte to her home city of Savannah. She was running slightly ahead of schedule, thanks to light traffic and unusually mild winter weather. The stretch of Interstate 95 through South Carolina was familiar territory, a route she had driven hundreds of times. But she also knew this section of highway possessed a dark and tragic history. A particular 20-mile stretch between the towns of Walterboro and Ridgeland had earned a grim reputation among local law enforcement and truckers alike. Over the past decade, it had been the site of multiple, horrific, fatal accidents, earning it the whispered nickname, the Corridor of Tears. The accidents had been varied and brutal. Head-on collisions caused by drivers falling asleep at the wheel, jackknife tractor-trailers that blocked all lanes during sudden, dense fog, and single-vehicle accidents where the cause was never determined. Maria had driven through the aftermath of several of these crashes, and she always felt a profound sense of unease when traveling through this area, especially at night. It was approaching 11 o'clock when Maria first heard the voice. She was monitoring Channel 19, the standard frequency for general communication, when a man's voice broke through the usual static with a clarity and intensity that was startling. "Southbound traffic on Interstate 95. The voice announced, sharp and professional. "Be advised, there is a serious hazard ahead at mile marker 43. Repeat, mile marker 43 has a major obstruction in the right-hand lane. Exercise extreme caution." The warning was delivered with the precision of a seasoned driver. But something about the voice itself disturbed Maria deeply. The tone was hollow and distant, with a strange, faint echo, as if the speaker were transmitting from inside a large, empty warehouse or a deep underground tunnel. She had been monitoring CB radio traffic for years and had heard voices from all over the country, but she had never heard anything that sounded quite like this. Maria checked her GPS display. Mile marker 43 was approximately 15 miles ahead of her current position. She keyed her microphone, her training and sense of duty overriding her unease. "Thanks for the heads up, driver. This is the southbound textile hauler at mile marker 28. Can you give me more details about the nature of the hazard?" She waited for a response, but the only reply was the soft hiss of static. Several minutes passed in silence. Then, the same voice returned, and the words it spoke made Maria's blood run cold. "Southbound textile hauler," the voice said, the strange echo more pronounced now. "This is Jimmy Patterson, speaking from the beyond. The hazard at mile marker 43 is my overturned truck. I jackknifed in a fog bank on the 15th of November, 2019. My trailer is still blocking the right lane. You need to move to the left to avoid a collision." Maria felt her hands begin to tremble on the steering wheel. The voice had identified her specifically as the textile hauler, even though she had not mentioned her cargo. More disturbing, far more disturbing, was the claim that the speaker was speaking from the beyond, and the casual, matter-of-fact way he had stated it. She tried to rationalize what she was hearing. It had to be a prank, an elaborate, sick joke, perhaps another driver who knew her handle was using information from public records to create a convincing ghost story. The name, date, and location of the accident were specific enough to be verifiable. Maria grabbed her cell phone and, with shaking fingers, called her dispatcher. She asked him to check with the South Carolina Department of Transportation for any current road hazards or accidents in her area. The dispatcher put her on hold. A minute later, he came back on the line. His voice was clear and certain. Interstate 95 was completely clear. There were no reported obstructions, no accidents, no hazards of any kind. As Maria approached mile marker 43, she slowed her rig and activated her hazard lights, her eyes scanning the road ahead with intense focus. The highway appeared completely normal. The pavement was clear, visibility was perfect under the moonlit sky, and there were no obstructions in either lane. She passed the location without incident, but the mysterious CB transmission had left her deeply, profoundly unsettled. She keyed her microphone again, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and frustration. "Jimmy Patterson, if you're still there, this is the southbound textile hauler. I just passed mile marker 43. The road is clear. I did not see any hazards or obstructions. Can you clarify your location?" The response came immediately, delivered in that same hollow, distant voice that seemed to echo from a place beyond the reach of normal radio waves. "Maria Santos of Jacksonville, Florida," the voice said, and the use of her full name and hometown sent a shockwave of pure terror through her. "You passed through the location where my physical times truck came to rest. But my spirit truck remains there forever. I died in that accident, crushed in my cab when my trailer rolled over during the jackknife. I have been trying to warn other drivers about this danger zone ever since." Maria had not provided her name or her hometown during any CB transmission that evening. That information was not displayed on any external part of her truck. She had not discussed personal details with anyone during her entire journey. Fear began to override all rational thought as she realized she was dealing with something that existed far outside the boundaries of normal human experience. "This has to be some kind of sick joke," Maria transmitted, though her voice was now shaking uncontrollably. "There is no way you could know my name or where I live." The response was not from one voice, but from many. Suddenly, the CB frequency erupted with a chorus of hollow, distant transmissions, all speaking over one another, creating a cacophony of ghostly voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "This is Robert Hayes," one voice cut through the static. "Killed in a head-on collision at mile marker 37 on the 8th of March, 2021. Watch for ice on the bridge approaches. Maria, black ice took my life." "This is Danny Morrison," another voice, younger and filled with a strange, echoing panic, broke in. "Died in a multi-vehicle pileup at mile marker 51 during heavy fog on the 3rd of October, 2018. Visibility drops to 0 without warning in this section. Slow down and use your hazard lights." "This is Carl Thompson," a third, gravelly voice added. "Jackknifed and burned at mile marker 39 on the 22nd of June, 2020. My trailer was carrying chemicals that exploded on impact. The roadway still holds the memory of the fire." The voices continued, a horrifying chorus of the dead. Each one provided specific, verifiable details of their own demise, accident types, dates, and exact locations along the very stretch of Interstate 95 that Maria was currently traveling. Some warned about treacherous weather hazards, others described sudden mechanical failures, and several spoke with cold anger about the drunk or distracted drivers who had caused their fatal collisions. Maria pulled over at the next rest area, her body trembling so violently she could barely control the truck. She spent nearly an hour in the brightly lit parking lot, her hands shaking as she used her cell phone's internet connection to research the accidents mentioned in the CB transmissions. She found them all. News reports, state police records, and online memorials confirmed every single incident described by the mysterious voices. Jimmy Patterson had died in a jackknife accident at mile marker 43 inches, November 2019. Robert Hayes had been killed in a head-on collision at mile marker 37 inches, March 2021. Each accident had occurred exactly as the voices on the CB radio had described. The most disturbing aspect, the part that made her question her own sanity, was the accuracy of the personal information the voices possessed about her. They knew her full name, her hometown, the type of cargo she was hauling, and had even hinted at details about her family background that were not matters of public record. The voices spoke with an intimate knowledge of her fears, her concerns, and her driving habits, as if they had been watching her, monitoring her, for years. As Maria prepared to resume her journey, her nerves shot. The CB radio crackled with one final, collective transmission that made her question everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the afterlife. Maria Santos, the voice was a blend of all the others, a unified, spectral chorus. "We are the collective voice of all the drivers who have died on this stretch of highway. We remain here to warn the living about the dangers that still exist. Our deaths were not meaningless if we can prevent others from sharing our fate. Listen to our warnings, drive safely, and remember that some roads hold memories that never fade." Maria completed her journey to Savannah without further incident. But she was a changed woman. She was deeply shaken by the experience. She began to research the history of that 20-mile stretch of Interstate 95 inches South Carolina and discovered that it had one of the highest fatal accident rates for commercial drivers in the entire southeastern United States. Over 40 truck drivers had died in that corridor during the past 15 years, victims of weather, mechanical failure, and human error. On her subsequent trips through South Carolina, she began carrying a digital recorder, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural CB transmissions. The voices returned during every single journey she made through the accident corridor. They always provided specific, accurate warnings about hazards that other drivers had not yet encountered. They warned her of sudden fog banks, patches of black ice, and even alerted her to a drunk driver who was swerving erratically miles ahead of her, giving her enough time to alert the highway patrol and potentially save lives. Maria never heard the voices on any other highway or in any other state. They seemed to be permanently, spiritually tethered to that specific stretch of Interstate 95, bound by some supernatural obligation to protect other drivers from suffering the same fate they had experienced. She learned to welcome their warnings, to see them not as terrifying ghosts, but as guardian angels of the highway. Over time, Maria began to recognize the individual voices among the chorus of the dead. Jimmy Patterson became her most frequent communicator, often providing detailed weather updates and traffic information. Robert Hayes specialized in warnings about dangerous drivers and potential collision situations. Danny Morrison seemed to have an uncanny ability to predict mechanical failures, once warning her about a slow leak in one of her tires, hours before her pressure sensors detected the problem. The voices never asked for anything in return. They seemed to exist solely to protect the living drivers from the hazards that had claimed their own lives. Maria began to think of them as a spectral brotherhood, drivers who had chosen to remain on the highway rather than moving on to whatever comes after death. Years later, when Maria finally retired from long-haul trucking, she made one final journey through the accident corridor on Interstate 95. The CB voices were waiting for her, offering their familiar warnings and guidance. As she passed mile marker 43 for the very last time, Jimmy Patterson's voice came through the radio, clearer than she had ever heard it before. Safe travels, Maria Santos. Thank you for listening to our warnings and for remembering our stories. May your journey through life be safer than ours were through death. Maria never heard the voices again, but for the rest of her life, she kept a CB radio in her personal vehicle, and whenever she drove through South Carolina, she would tune it to Channel 19. She knew that somewhere out on Interstate 95, the spirits of dead truckers were still watching over the highway, still trying to prevent other drivers from joining their eternal, lonely vigil in the corridor where far too many journeys had come to a tragic and untimely end. Clara Thompson was a trucker who specialized in the forgotten capillaries of the American Deep South. For 11 years, she had hauled freight on the winding, two-lane highways of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama, delivering goods to small towns and rural communities, often overlooked by the larger shipping conglomerates. She prided herself on knowing every back road, every family-owned truck stop, and every greasy spoon diner along her regular routes. She had built relationships with local business owners who appreciated her unwavering reliability and the cheerful professionalism she brought to a job dominated by gruff, solitary men. That particular March evening, Clara was hauling a load of farming equipment from Jackson down to Natchez, running slightly behind schedule. A mechanical delay with her truck's refrigeration unit, a system her current cargo didn't even require, was causing a cascade of intermittent electrical problems. Her dashboard lights would flicker and die for minutes at a time, and her radio reception would fade in and out, replaced by bursts of static and strange, ethereal music. Clara planned to have the whole system overhauled when she reached her destination, but as night fell, the increasingly frequent electrical gremlins were becoming more than just a nuisance. They were becoming a safety concern. Highway 61 through central Mississippi was territory Clara knew like the back of her hand. This particular section was known for its profound isolation and limited services. The route passed through vast, flat expanses of cotton fields, dense timber forests, and primordial swampland that seemed utterly unchanged since the Civil War era. During the daylight hours, the landscape possessed a kind of peaceful, rustic beauty. But at night, it took on a heavy, ominous quality that made many drivers opt for the longer, more modern interstate routes. Clara was approaching the historic community of Vicksburg when her fuel gauge, which had been behaving erratically all evening, suddenly plunged into the red. She had calculated her fuel consumption meticulously before starting her run and knew, logically, that she should have more than enough diesel to reach Natchez. But the faulty electrical system was making her gauges unreliable, and the thought of being stranded on this lonely stretch of highway in the dead of night was a risk she was unwilling to take. She began scanning the dark horizon for the familiar, comforting glow of a truck stop. It was approaching midnight when she saw it. A warm, inviting glow of neon signs bloomed out of the darkness ahead, illuminating what appeared to be a classic, old-fashioned truck stop diner. The establishment looked like a perfect time capsule from the 1,950 seconds, complete with gleaming chrome fixtures, bold neon lettering, and a sprawling parking area filled with vehicles that seemed to belong to a much earlier era. Clara didn't remember seeing this particular diner on her previous trips, but truck stops occasionally changed ownership or underwent renovations that could drastically alter their appearance. It was a welcome sight, regardless. Clara guided her rig into the parking lot, and a strange, prickling sensation ran up her spine. Something felt profoundly unusual about the entire scene. The other vehicles in the lot were not just old, They were vintage models from the 1940 seconds and 1950 seconds, all immaculately maintained and polished to a showroom shine. Several large trucks were parked in the commercial vehicle area, but they were older models, Max, Kenworths, and Peterbilts, with designs and configurations that had not been manufactured for decades. The diner itself was a perfect, gleaming example of mid-century American architecture. It had polished chrome siding that reflected the neon lights, large plate glass windows, and a sign that simply read, "The Highway 61 Diner," in looping cursive script. The interior was visible through the windows, revealing cozy red vinyl booths, a black and white checkered floor, and a long counter with spinning stools that looked like they had been pulled directly from a Norman Rockwell painting. Clara parked her modern 18-wheeler, which looked utterly alien and out of place among the vintage vehicles, and walked toward the diner's entrance. As she approached, she could hear music playing from within. It wasn't the tinny sound of a jukebox or a modern sound system. It was the rich, layered sound of live big band and swing music, the kind of melodies that had filled the airwaves in the 1940 seconds. The door opened with the familiar, cheerful chime of a traditional diner bell, and Clara stepped into an atmosphere that felt like it had transported her back several decades in time. The interior was exactly as she had seen from the outside, but the attention to period detail was astonishing. Every fixture, every decoration, every piece of furniture appeared to be an authentic 1950 seconds antique, maintained in perfect, pristine condition without any visible signs of wear, tear, or aging. The other customers in the diner were all dressed in clothing styles from the early 1950 seconds. The men wore suits, hats, and ties, despite the late hour. The women were in dresses and had hairstyles that belonged to the Eisenhower era. They all appeared to be enjoying their meals and conversations, their voices mingling in a relaxed, happy murmur. But something about their collective demeanor felt strange. It was as if they were not quite connected to the present moment, existing in a bubble of their own time. A waitress approached Clara, her smile warm and genuine. She wore a classic pink and white uniform with a starched white apron and a small cap perched perfectly on her head. Her name tag, pinned neatly to her collar, read Betty. She spoke with the cheerful, slightly formal professionalism that characterized service industry workers from a bygone generation. "Welcome to the Highway 61 Diner, honey," Betty said, her voice carrying a slight, lilting southern accent. "You look like you could use a good, hot meal and some fresh coffee. We've got fresh baked apple pie and the best chicken fried steak in all of Mississippi." Clara looked around the diner more carefully and realized that none of the other customers seemed to have noticed her presence. They continued their conversations and meals without so much as a glance in her direction, as if a woman in modern trucker attire entering their establishment was a perfectly normal occurrence. The men discussed topics like baseball games, factory jobs, and local politics, but all of their references were to events and situations from decades ago. A strange, bold question formed in Clara's mind. "What year is this?" she asked Betty, her voice barely a whisper. Betty smiled, unfazed by the bizarre question. She glanced at a large, paper calendar hanging on the wall behind the counter. It displayed a picture of a smiling family next to a brand new Chevrolet. The month and year were clearly visible. March 1952. "Why, it's 1952, honey," Betty replied, her brow furrowing slightly with concern. "It's been 1952 all year. Are you feeling all right? You look a little pale." Clara felt her heart begin to hammer against her ribs. She had somehow, impossibly, stepped into a diner that was existing in the year 1952. She had been driving on Highway 61 inches the 21st century just minutes before. The logical part of her mind screamed that this was impossible, a hallucination brought on by fatigue and the flickering lights of her truck. But the evidence of her senses, the sights, the sounds, the smells of this place was overwhelming and undeniable. "I need to use your telephone," Clara stammered, desperate for a connection to her own time. "I need to call my company and let them know where I am." Betty led Clara to an old-fashioned wooden payphone booth in the corner of the diner, complete with a folding door and a black, heavy rotary dial. "That'll be a nickel for a local call, honey," Betty said kindly. "Long distance costs extra, of course." Clara fumbled in her pockets. She didn't have any coins from 1952, and she doubted that modern currency would work in the antique phone. She pulled out her cell phone, but the screen was blank. No service. Her modern technology was a useless, dead brick in a world that existed decades before it had even been invented. Defeated, Clara returned to the counter and ordered a cup of coffee, hoping to gather her thoughts and figure out a way to return to her own time. Betty served the coffee in a heavy, white ceramic mug that was warm to the touch. The coffee was rich, dark, and flavorful in a way that modern, mass-produced coffee rarely achieved. As Clara sat at the counter, sipping the coffee, she listened to the conversations swirling around her. She began to understand the true nature of the temporal displacement she was experiencing. The other customers were discussing events from early 1952 as if they were current news. Harry Truman's presidency, the ongoing war in Korea, and local community issues that Clara knew, from her own time's history books, had been resolved decades ago. One man mentioned that he worked at a local cotton mill, a mill that Clara knew for a fact had been shut down and demolished in the 1970 seconds. Another man discussed his plans to take his family to see a movie that had been released in 1952. Everything in the diner was an authentic, living snapshot of life in 1952, not a nostalgic recreation. Then, Clara realized that her modern truck had begun to cause a disturbance. Through the large front window, she could see that her massive, aerodynamic 18-wheeler was drawing attention in the parking lot. The owners of the vintage vehicles were gathering outside, staring at the anachronistic machine that did not belong in their time. They pointed and gestured, their expressions a mixture of awe, confusion, and suspicion. Betty approached. Clara again, her cheerful demeanor now replaced with a look of genuine concern. "Honey," she said, her voice low, "that truck of yours is causing quite a stir. Nobody around here has ever seen anything like it. Some folks are saying it looks like something out of one of those science fiction picture shows." Clara knew she had to leave. Her presence and the presence of her futuristic vehicle was disrupting the delicate fabric of this time-locked place. She fumbled in her wallet and pulled out a modern $20 bill to pay for her coffee. Betty accepted it without comment, though she examined the unfamiliar bill with obvious confusion, her fingers tracing the intricate security features and the portrait of a president she didn't recognize. As Clara walked back toward her truck, she noticed that the vintage vehicles in the parking lot were starting their engines and pulling away, their owners seemingly uncomfortable with the presence of technology from the future. The customers still inside the diner were now pressed against the windows, watching her with expressions of curiosity and a palpable sense of fear. Clara climbed into her truck and started the engine. The powerful, modern diesel engine sounded impossibly loud and aggressive compared to the softer, rumbling engines of the 1950 seconds vehicles. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she glanced in her rearview mirror. The diner was beginning to fade. Its bright neon lights flickered and dimmed, and its solid, chrome structure was becoming translucent and ghostly, as if her departure was causing the entire establishment to recede back into whatever dimension it normally occupied. By the time Clara reached the highway, the diner had vanished completely. She slammed on her brakes and walked back to the spot where it had stood just moments before. There was nothing there but an empty, overgrown field, with no sign that any building had ever existed on that spot. Her truck's dashboard lights suddenly glowed, with a steady, consistent light. Her GPS system flickered back to life, and her cell phone chimed as it regained a strong signal. The temporal displacement had ended. Clara completed her delivery to Natchez on schedule, but she spent the following days obsessively researching the history of Highway 61 and the Vicksburg area. She discovered that a truck stop diner, the Highway 61 diner, had indeed operated at that exact location from 1948 until 1956. It had been a popular gathering place for travelers and local residents until it was tragically destroyed by a fire that had claimed the lives of several customers and employees, including a beloved waitress named Betty. Photographs from that era showed a building that matched exactly what Clara had experienced, down to the smallest architectural details and the looping, cursive script of its neon sign. Clara never encountered the 1952 diner again, despite driving Highway 61 regularly for the rest of her trucking career. She would occasionally stop at the empty field where the diner had appeared, hoping to find some trace of the temporal anomaly she had experienced. Sometimes, late at night, when the air was still and the moon was full, she thought she could see the faint, ghostly glow of neon signs in the distance, but they always disappeared when she tried to approach. Clara learned that some places exist outside the normal flow of time, preserving moments from the past in spaces that can, under special circumstances, be accessed. She believed that her truck's faulty electrical system had somehow resonated with the residual energy of the old diner, creating a temporary bridge between 1952 and the present, allowing her a brief, poignant glimpse of life as it had been lived decades before she was born. The experience taught her that the highways of America held memories that transcended normal chronology, and that sometimes the past could reach forward to touch the present in ways that defied all rational explanation. Robert Hayes was a man who drove into the teeth of storms. For 16 years, he had specialized in emergency freight deliveries, a high-stakes job that often required him to drive through severe weather conditions when other, more cautious truckers chose to wait for safer passage. He prided himself on his ability to navigate through blizzards, ice storms, and the terrifying, swirling funnels of tornadoes. He was the man they called when critical supplies had to get through, when hospitals were running low on medicine, and when communities were cut off and desperate. That particular January evening, Robert was hauling a life-or-death load of medical supplies from Kansas City to Oklahoma City. He was racing against a massive winter storm system that meteorologists were calling a once-in-a-generation blizzard. The National Weather Service had issued dire warnings for the entire region. Whiteout conditions, dangerously low wind chills, and feet of accumulating snow that would make highway travel impossible for days. While other drivers were chaining up their tires and settling in at truck stops, Robert had volunteered to make the emergency run. He knew that hospitals in Oklahoma were desperately waiting for the medications and equipment he was carrying. The stretch of Interstate 35 through the flat, open plains of central Kansas was notorious for its brutal winter weather. The highway crossed a vast expanse of prairie land with no natural windbreaks, creating a perfect wind tunnel for blowing snow and ice formation. It was a route that could transform from a routine drive into a life-threatening survival situation in a matter of minutes. Robert had driven this route during winter storms before, but the forecast for this particular blizzard was more severe than anything he had ever experienced. As Robert approached the small community of Emporia, the first delicate snowflakes began to dance in his headlights. Within minutes, the light snow had intensified into a driving, horizontal blizzard that reduced his visibility to less than 50 feet. The wind was howling across the prairie with a raw, physical force, buffeting his massive truck with gusts that threatened to push him off the highway and into the deep, snow-filled ditches. He reduced his speed to a crawl and activated his hazard lights, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He knew that the next 100 miles would test every skill he had honed during his years of winter driving. Robert was struggling to keep his truck centered in the lane, his world reduced to the faint, ghostly outlines of the reflective markers on the roadside, when he noticed headlights appearing behind him in his mirrors. At first, he felt a surge of relief. Seeing another driver brave enough to continue traveling in such severe weather was comforting. Having company on the highway during a blizzard could mean the difference between life and death if either vehicle encountered problems. As the headlights grew closer, Robert realized he was not looking at a single truck, but an entire convoy. He counted at least 8, possibly 10, vehicles traveling in a perfect, single-file line through the heart of the storm. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. During severe weather events, truckers sometimes formed informal convoys for safety, using their collective mass to punch a path through the snow and sharing information about the treacherous road conditions ahead. Robert reached for his CB radio, hoping to coordinate their travel and share what little information he could glean about the road ahead. Northbound convoy behind the medical supply truck, he broadcast, his voice steady. "This is your lead vehicle. Good to have some company out here. What's your 20? And what are your intentions for this storm?" The radio remained silent. He tried again, his voice a little louder this time. "Hey, lead truck of the convoy, you got your ears on? Just looking to coordinate our speed. Here, let's get through this together." The only response was the crackle of static, made harsher by the electrical charge of the storm. Robert could see the convoy maintaining a steady, unwavering following distance, but none of the trucks responded to his communication attempts. This was puzzling and a little unsettling. Convoy coordination was built on a foundation of constant radio contact. It was essential for maintaining safe spacing and providing mutual assistance. Radio silence in a situation like this was not just strange, it was dangerous. As the storm intensified, Robert noticed something deeply disturbing about the vehicles following him. Their headlights appeared unusually dim and diffused, as if they were struggling to penetrate the swirling wall of snow, despite their close following distance. More concerning was the fact that he could not make out any details of the trucks themselves. Even when they were close enough that he should have been able to identify the make, model, and configuration of each vehicle, they remained indistinct, shadowy shapes, their forms blurred and distorted by the storm. Robert reduced his speed even further, his truck now barely moving, and flashed his brake lights several times, a clear signal for the vehicles behind him to slow down. Normally, following vehicles would acknowledge such a signal with their own lights or a quick radio call. But the mysterious convoy maintained exactly the same speed and distance, their dim headlights never wavering, their formation never breaking. They seemed completely unresponsive to his actions. The blizzard reached its full, terrifying intensity as Robert approached the outskirts of Wichita. Visibility had dropped to absolute zero. He was now navigating entirely by feel, keeping his right side tires on the grooved edge of the pavement, praying the road ahead was clear. The wind was creating massive snow drifts that were beginning to encroach on the highway, and Robert knew that continuing much further would be suicidal, even for a driver with his experience. He made the decision to exit the highway and seek shelter at a large, 24-hour truck stop he knew was just ahead. He activated his turn signal and began to carefully maneuver his truck toward the exit ramp. As he glanced in his mirrors one last time, he saw that the convoy behind him was not following his lead. Their dim, ghostly headlights continued straight down the interstate, heading directly into the most violent part of the storm, without slowing or changing direction. It was as if the drivers were either unaware of his intention to exit or were compelled by some unseen force to continue on their predetermined route, regardless of the impossible conditions. Robert parked his truck at the miraculously open truck stop and, pulling his coat tight against the raging wind, walked back toward the highway overpass. He peered through the blowing snow, trying to spot the convoy. He could just make out their dim headlights disappearing into the white void, maintaining their perfect, silent formation, driving deeper into a storm that should have made further travel impossible for any rational, living driver. Inside the truck stop's warm, brightly lit restaurant, Robert discovered he was not the only driver who had been forced to seek shelter. Several other truckers were gathered, nursing cups of coffee and sharing stories of the harrowing driving conditions they had just escaped. Robert asked if any of them had seen the convoy of trucks that had been following him. None of them had. They all reported that the highway had been completely deserted. An elderly driver named Carl was sitting alone in a corner booth, his weathered face a roadmap of long years on the road. He was staring out the window at the blizzard, a look of profound sadness in his tired eyes. Robert, feeling a strange compulsion, approached him and described the phantom convoy he had encountered. Carl looked up at Robert, his eyes holding a deep, ancient knowledge of the highway's secrets. "Son," he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "how many trucks were in this convoy you saw?" 8 or 10, at least," Robert replied, "all traveling in perfect formation, right through the worst of the storm." Carl nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. "And they didn't respond to any of your radio calls?" "No," Robert said, "complete radio silence. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen." Carl was quiet for several long minutes, his gaze lost in the swirling snow outside. Then, he gestured for Robert to sit down across from him. 23 years ago, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, during a blizzard just like this one, on this very stretch of I-35, a convoy of 8 trucks was caught in a complete whiteout about 50 miles north of here. They were hauling emergency relief supplies, food, water, blankets to communities in Oklahoma that had been completely cut off by the storm. Robert felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather raging outside. "What happened to them?" he asked, his own voice now a whisper. "They refused to stop," Carl said, his eyes clouding over with the memory. "They were determined to get their deliveries through, believing that people were depending on them." The entire convoy hit a massive patch of black ice hidden under the snow. It was a chain reaction pileup. All 8 trucks jackknifed. All 8 drivers died in the accident. Their bodies weren't recovered until the storm finally passed, 3 days later. Carl continued his story, his voice heavy with a sorrow that was still fresh after more than 2 decades. Ever since that night, other drivers have reported seeing them, the phantom convoy. They only appear during the most severe winter storms, always on this stretch of I-35. They always travel the same route, following the same path they were taking on the night they died. Some folks say they're still trying to complete their delivery mission, even in death. Robert stared out the window at the storm. The image of the dim, unwavering headlights burned into his mind. Do you think they're still out there right now?" "I think," Carl answered, his voice filled with a strange reverence, "that some drivers are so committed to their responsibilities that not even death can stop them from trying to fulfill their obligations. They continue driving the same routes, hauling the same phantom cargo, following the same schedules they maintained in life." Robert spent the rest of the night at the truck stop, unable to sleep, his mind consumed with the thought of the ghostly convoy that had accompanied him through the worst of the blizzard. When dawn finally broke and the snow stopped falling, he resumed his journey to Oklahoma City. He completed his delivery of medical supplies on schedule, his sense of purpose now mingled with a profound sense of awe and respect. Over the following years, Robert encountered the phantom convoy several more times, always during the most severe winter storms on Interstate 35. The experience always followed the same eerie pattern. 8 to 10 shadowy trucks would appear behind him during the most dangerous weather conditions, maintaining their perfect formation and absolute radio silence. They would follow him, a silent, ghostly escort, until he sought shelter, at which point they would continue on into the storm, disappearing into the white chaos. Robert learned to welcome the presence of the phantom convoy. He no longer saw them as a terrifying apparition, but as a protective, spiritual presence. He believed that the dead drivers were providing a spectral shield for the living truckers who were brave enough or desperate enough to drive during such dangerous conditions. He believed the convoy served as a solemn reminder that some responsibilities transcended death, and that the commitment to delivering essential supplies could create a bond that lasted beyond the grave. The phantom convoy of I-35 had become a part of the highway's folklore, a testament to the unbreakable bond between truckers who shared the sacred commitment to keeping America's freight moving, regardless of the personal cost. James Mitchell was a master of the mountains. For 14 years, his entire trucking career had been spent navigating the treacherous passes and steep, winding grades of the Colorado Rockies. While other drivers dreaded the routes that crossed the Continental Divide, James specialized in them. He hauled freight between Denver and the Western Slope communities, and he prided himself on knowing every curve, every elevation change, and every potential hazard on Interstate 70. He knew the precise locations of the runaway truck ramps, the optimal gear selections for the most brutal descents, and the subtle shifts in the clouds that signaled a sudden, violent weather change. The Eisenhower Tunnel, a passage bored through the very heart of the mountains at over 11,000 feet, was like a second home to him. That particular February evening, James was hauling a load of heavy machinery parts from Denver to Grand Junction. He was running exactly on schedule, a point of professional pride, despite an earlier delay caused by chain requirements on Vail Pass. The weather, for once, was on his side. The sky was a vast, clear canvas of glittering stars. The air was cold and crisp, and visibility was perfect. All mountain passes were open with normal winter driving conditions. It was a perfect night for a mountain run. The drive through the Eisenhower Tunnel was routine. The familiar hum of the lights, the pressure change in his ears, the brief, womb-like enclosure before bursting back out into the immense mountain landscape. James began his long, careful descent toward the town of Silverthorne, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind already calculating the next several miles of road. It was then that he first noticed something was wrong. It was something small, something most drivers would never even register. It was the mile markers. The green rectangular signs that marked the distance along the interstate were as familiar to James as his own reflection. He used them constantly for navigation, for timing, and for his logbook entries. But as he descended from the tunnel, the numbers displayed on the signs seemed to be wrong. They didn't match his GPS coordinates or his own internal flawless map of the highway. At first, James assumed it was a simple error with his electronic navigation system. The mountainous terrain could sometimes interfere with GPS signals, causing temporary, minor inaccuracies. He wasn't concerned. But as he continued driving, a cold, creeping sense of dread began to settle in his stomach. The mile markers weren't just wrong, they were counting times backwards. Instead of the numbers increasing as he traveled west, indicating his progress toward his destination, the signs showed decreasing numbers. It was as if he were traveling in the wrong direction, heading back east toward Denver. James pulled over at the next available shoulder, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. He checked everything. His compass confirmed he was heading west. His GPS system, now showing a strong, clear signal, confirmed he was traveling westbound on I-70. His paper maps, a backup he always carried, confirmed his location and direction. All of his trusted navigation equipment told him he was going the right way, but the mile markers told a different story. The first sign after the tunnel should have read mile 213. Instead, it read mile 212. The next one read 211, then 210. James was moving forward through space, but the road itself was insisting he was traveling backwards through distance. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the Colorado Department of Transportation was in the process of replacing the signs and had made a bizarre error. But there were no construction zones, no warning signs, no temporary traffic control devices anywhere. The mile markers appeared to be the permanent, official installations, bolted firmly in their standard locations. Shaken, James pulled back onto the highway. As he resumed driving, he noticed that his fuel gauge was behaving strangely. Despite running his powerful engine continuously and maintaining highway speeds on a steep grade, the fuel level remained absolutely constant. The needle was frozen, stuck at the exact same position it had been in when he left the tunnel. His electronic fuel monitoring system, a highly sensitive piece of equipment, showed zero change in fuel consumption. It was as if his truck were somehow running without consuming a single drop of diesel. The landscape around him also began to feel subtly, terrifyingly wrong. James knew this section of highway intimately. He knew the shape of every peak, the curve of every valley, the silhouette of every ridge against the night sky. But the mountains he was seeing now did not match his memory. Familiar peaks that should have been visible in the distance were missing, replaced by unfamiliar, jagged ridgelines that seemed to loom closer, more menacingly than they should. The vast, glittering expanse of the Dillon Reservoir, which should have been visible from several vantage points on this descent, was nowhere to be seen. It had simply vanished. He grabbed his CB radio, desperate to hear another human voice, to get confirmation of his location and the road conditions. He broadcast on Channel 19, his voice tight with anxiety. "Any westbound drivers on I-70, just west of the Eisenhower? Looking for a road condition update. Things are looking a little strange out here." The radio remained utterly silent. He could hear the faint hiss of static, but there were no local transmissions, no familiar voices of the other night shift drivers he regularly encountered on this route. It was as if he were the only person on the entire highway. The mile markers continued their relentless, impossible backward countdown as James drove deeper into what felt like an alternate, nightmare version of the Colorado Rockies. The highway itself appeared normal, the lane markings were clear, the guardrails were solid, but the surrounding environment was becoming increasingly alien. The trees grew in strange, unnatural patterns, and the snow coverage on the mountains didn't correspond to the elevation or the weather conditions. A suffocating sense of claustrophobia began to press in on him. The wide, majestic valley through which I-70 normally ran seemed to be narrowing, the mountains closing in around him like the walls of a stone trap. The highway itself began to curve more sharply and climb more steeply than the actual route, creating a disorienting, maddening sense of being trapped in an endless, looping maze of asphalt and rock. After driving for what felt like hours, James realized with a jolt of pure terror that he had not encountered a single other vehicle. Not a single car, not a single truck. I-70, one of the busiest commercial and passenger corridors in the state, was completely, unnaturally empty. The mile markers had now counted backwards from 212 to 150. According to the road, he had traveled over 60 miles in the wrong direction. But his odometer showed that he had actually driven 60 miles forward, and his GPS continued to report his steady westbound progress toward Grand Junction. The contradiction between his truck's instruments and the physical reality of the road was a paradox that made his head spin. In a desperate move, James decided to turn around. He used an emergency vehicle turnaround to reverse his direction, his massive rig groaning in protest. He began driving eastbound, back toward the Eisenhower Tunnel, back toward the familiar. But as he traveled in the opposite direction, the mile markers' times continued to count backwards. Instead of the numbers increasing as he headed back toward Denver, the signs showed decreasing numbers. 149, 148, 147. He was still moving backwards through distance, no matter which physical direction he drove. The fuel gauge remained frozen. The alien landscape continued to press in on him. He was trapped. He was driving endlessly, burning no fuel, covering no ground, on a road that was actively erasing his progress. He tried to exit. He saw an off-ramp for a town that didn't exist on any map and took it, hoping to find a truck stop, a gas station, a human being. The exit ramp led to a road that simply ended after a few hundred yards, terminating in an impassable solid wall of rock and snow. He had to perform a difficult, dangerous maneuver to get his rig turned around. When he returned to the highway, he saw a mile marker that read Mile 20. The road had now stolen nearly 200 miles from him. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. He had been driving for over 6 hours without making any measurable progress. His electronic logging device, the unblinking eye of the federal government, showed that he had been driving continuously, but the GPS coordinates on the device remained frozen at the exact same location just west of the Eisenhower Tunnel, as if his truck had been running in place for hours. As the first hint of dawn approached, James noticed that the sky was brightening in the wrong direction. Instead of the sun rising in the east, a pale, sickly light was beginning to glow from the west. The mountains, now illuminated by this reverse sunrise, cast long, impossible shadows that fell in the wrong directions, creating a landscape that seemed to exist outside the fundamental laws of physics. In a final, desperate act of will, James made a decision. He would ignore the road. He would ignore the mile markers, the GPS, the compass. He would trust only himself. He focused his eyes on a distant, unfamiliar peak in what he felt was the correct, westerly direction. And he drove toward it, his foot steady on the accelerator. He began talking to himself, his own voice a lifeline in the crushing silence. "My name is James Mitchell. I am hauling machinery to Grand Junction. My name is James Mitchell." He repeated it over and over, a mantra to keep himself anchored to reality. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the world began to correct itself. The landscape started to look more familiar. The mile markers, when he dared to glance at them, began to display numbers that increased in the proper sequence. His fuel gauge quivered and then began to drop, its normal, steady descent a welcome, beautiful sight. The GPS system flickered and then began reporting accurate, moving coordinates. And then, the most wonderful sound he had ever heard, the crackle of the CB radio, and a familiar voice complaining about the price of coffee in Glenwood Springs. James emerged from the impossible mountain loop and found himself pulling into a truck stop near Glenwood Springs, over 100 miles from where he thought he should be. According to his electronic logs, he had been driving for over 8 hours, but his fuel consumption indicated only 2 hours of normal highway operation. The timestamp on his arrival showed that he had somehow driven through an entire night in what felt like a few terrifying, endless hours. James completed his delivery to Grand Junction, but he never spoke of his experience in the backward mile marker zone. He knew no one would believe him. They would blame it on altitude sickness, fatigue, or highway hypnosis. But James knew what he had experienced was real. He had driven on a road that was not on any map, a place where the rules of physics were suspended, where time and distance were fluid and malevolent. He had learned that some roads existed in the spaces between reality, and that a wrong turn could lead you to a place where you could drive forever without ever getting anywhere at all. David Chen was not a trucker by choice. He was a trucker by necessity. He was a quiet, unassuming man in his late 40s, a former accountant whose life had been dismantled by a bad economy and a series of even worse personal decisions. Now, he drove for a small, independent freight company out of Long Beach, California. The company, Westline Express, was a bottom feeder, taking the jobs the big corporations wouldn't touch, the last-minute runs, the undesirable routes, the cargo that was just slightly questionable. David didn't ask questions. He just took the keys, the manifest, and the road. His current assignment was a prime example. It was a hot-shot run, a load that needed to get from a nondescript warehouse in the industrial outskirts of Los Angeles to a similar warehouse in a remote corner of Arizona, just outside the town of Kingman. The manifest was vague, listing the cargo simply as proprietary industrial molds. The pay, however, was unusually high, and it was paid in cash, half up front, half on delivery. This was a red flag, but for David, red flags were just the color of money he desperately needed. The instructions were specific and strange. He was to drive a particular truck, Unit 734, and pull a specific refrigerated trailer, also numbered 734. The dispatcher, a gruff man named Sal, had been emphatic. "Don't touch the thermostat on the reefer, Chen. It's set to 34 degrees. It stays at 34 degrees. Don't look inside the trailer. The clients sealed it themselves. You just drive. You get there, you drop the trailer, you get your cash, and you drive away. Simple, simple." David repeated the word to himself as he guided Unit 734 onto the I-10, heading east into the vast, dark expanse of the Mojave Desert. The truck was old and temperamental, its engine rattling with a persistent cough. But the refrigerated trailer, the reefer, was brand new, its cooling unit humming with a quiet, steady efficiency. 34 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing, an odd temperature for industrial molds. But it wasn't his job to think, it was his job to drive. The first few hours were uneventful. The desert night was a profound and crushing emptiness. The highway, a lonely ribbon of light cutting through an ocean of black. David listened to talk radio to stay awake, The angry, disembodied voices, a strange sort of company. The reefer unit behind him hummed its constant, low-frequency song. It was around 1 a.m., somewhere past Indio, that he first heard it. Over the drone of the engine and the hum of the reefer, there was another sound. A soft, rhythmic times thump. It was faint, almost imperceptible, and it seemed to be coming from directly behind him, from inside the trailer. Thump, 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 asterisk. David turned down the radio. He listened intently. The sound was still there, a slow, steady, muffled beat. He tried to rationalize it. Cargo shifts. It happens. Maybe one of the molds had come loose from its pallet and was rocking back and forth with the motion of the truck. That had to be it. He turned the radio back up, trying to drown out the sound and the unease that was beginning to prickle at the back of his neck. But the sound didn't go away. An hour later, it was still there. Thump, thump, thump. Asterisk. It seemed more deliberate now, less like a random shifting and more like a steady, intentional beat. And there was something else, too. A new sound. A faint, scratching noise, like fingernails dragging slowly across a metal floor. David's blood ran cold. Sal's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk. Don't look inside the trailer. Asterisk. He was hauling something illegal. He knew it. Drugs, weapons, something the client didn't want anyone to see. But the sounds? Drugs and weapons don't make sounds. He pulled the truck over onto the shoulder of the deserted highway, the vast silence of the desert pressing in on him. He killed the engine. In the sudden quiet, the sounds from the trailer were horrifyingly clear. The rhythmic thumping was still there, but the scratching was louder now, more frantic. And beneath it, he could hear something else, a sound that made every hair on his body stand on end. It was a voice, a low, guttural moaning, the sound of someone in immense pain or terror. "Oh God," David whispered, his hands trembling. This wasn't drugs, this was human trafficking. He was hauling people. The industrial molds were a lie, and the refrigerated trailer, 34 degrees. They were transporting people in near-freezing temperatures. His mind raced. He had to do something. He had to call the police. But what would he say? That he'd knowingly taken a suspicious, cash-paid job? That he'd driven for hours with people in the back of his truck without checking? They would think he was part of it. He could go to prison for years. Sal's warning felt less like a client's instruction and more like a threat. Asterisk. Don't look inside. Asterisk. They would know if he broke the seal. They would know if he called the cops. And the people who paid this much cash for this kind of cargo were not people you wanted to cross. But the moaning, it was getting weaker now, interspersed with a desperate, rattling cough. Someone was dying back there. Torn between fear for his own life and the horror of what was happening in his trailer, David made a decision. He wouldn't call the police, not yet. But he couldn't let someone die. He had to see what was happening. He grabbed a tire iron from his toolbox, his heart hammering against his ribs, and walked to the back of the trailer. The trailer was secured with a heavy-duty bolt seal, a thick piece of metal with a unique serial number. Breaking it was a definitive act. There was no going back. He took a deep breath and, with a powerful swing, brought the tire iron down on the seal. It snapped with a loud crack that echoed in the desert silence. He pulled the heavy latch and swung the massive trailer doors open. The first thing that hit him was the smell. It was a coppery, metallic stench, the smell of blood, so thick and overwhelming that he gagged and stumbled backward. The second thing was the cold, a damp, penetrating chill that poured out of the trailer like a malevolent fog. He shone his flashlight inside. The scene was one of pure butchery. The floor of the trailer was slick with blood. In the center of the trailer were not industrial molds, but several large, white, insulated coolers, the kind used for transporting medical organs. Most of them were sealed, but one had been knocked over, its lid ajar. Spilling from it onto the floor were not organs, but dozens of plastic bags filled with a dark, viscous fluid. Bags of human blood. And in the far corner of the trailer, huddled against the wall, was the source of the sounds. It was a young woman, probably in her early 20s. She was emaciated, her skin deathly pale, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have burned out her soul. She was wearing only a thin hospital gown, and her arms were covered in IV lines and crude, surgical-looking taps, the kind used for draining fluids. One of the lines had been ripped from her arm, and it was the source of the blood that now pooled on the floor around her. She was the cargo. She was the source of the blood in the bags. She looked at David, her lips moving, but only a faint, rattling whisper came out. Cold. So cold. David felt a wave of nausea and horror so intense he almost passed out. This wasn't human trafficking. This was something far more monstrous. This was a mobile blood farm. They were keeping this woman alive in near-freezing temperatures to slow her metabolism, draining her blood to be sold on some horrific black market. He scrambled into the trailer, his boots slipping on the slick floor. "It's okay," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm going to help you. I'm getting you out of here." He reached for her, and as his fingers touched her skin, he recoiled. It was as cold as ice. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something shift. The terror in them was replaced by something else. Something ancient and predatory. Her head snapped up, her movements suddenly fast and unnatural. The weak, dying woman was gone. A faint, cruel smile touched her lips, and her eyes, which had been a dull brown, now seemed to glow with a faint, reddish light. "You broke the seal?" she whispered, her voice no longer weak, but clear, sharp, and filled with a chilling amusement. "You opened the door. He told you not to." "Who?" David stammered, backing away. "Who told me? The man who bought me," she said, her smile widening, revealing teeth that were just slightly too sharp. "He's very particular about his deliveries. He doesn't like his vintage to be disturbed." The rhythmic thumping started again, but it wasn't coming from the trailer anymore. It was coming from times outside. David spun around and looked out the open trailer doors. Standing on the highway, silhouetted against the distant glow of a passing car's headlights, was a tall, impossibly thin figure. It was too far away to see clearly, but David could feel its presence, a palpable aura of cold and ancient hunger. "You let the cold out, driver," the woman whispered from behind him, her voice now a low, predatory growl. "And you let him know I was awake." David turned back to her. She was standing now, her movements fluid and graceful, a stark contrast to the dying creature she had been moments before. The IV lines hung from her arms like grotesque jewelry. What are you?" he breathed. "I am the cargo," she said, taking a step toward him. "And he is the client. And you are the unfortunate soul who got in the way." The figure on the highway began to move toward the truck, its steps slow, deliberate, and utterly silent. It didn't walk like a human. It seemed to glide over the asphalt, an unnatural, flowing motion that made David's mind scream. He scrambled out of the trailer, falling to the gravel shoulder, and crab walked backward, his eyes fixed on the approaching figure. He could see it more clearly now. It was wearing a long, dark coat, and its face was a pale, featureless oval. It had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, white, terrifying blankness. From inside the trailer, he heard a soft, amused laugh. "There's nowhere to run on this road, David Chen," the woman's voice called out. "The desert is very, very large, and he is very, very hungry." David didn't wait to hear more. He got to his feet and ran. He ran into the pitch-black desert, away from the highway, away from the truck, away from the impossible things that were happening there. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, collapsing into the sand and scrub brush. He lay there for what felt like hours, listening. He heard no sirens, no helicopters, no sounds of a police investigation. After a long time, he heard the sound of his own truck, Unit 734, starting up. He watched as its headlights cut a path back onto the highway, and it continued its journey east, disappearing into the darkness as if nothing had happened. David was found at dawn by a highway patrol officer, wandering deliriously along the interstate, dehydrated and incoherent. His story was dismissed as a fantasy, a psychotic break brought on by stress and amphetamines, a common affliction among long-haul drivers. There was no record of a Westline Express freight company. The truck, Unit 734, was never found. The warehouses in Los Angeles and Arizona, when investigated, were found to be empty, abandoned for years. David Chen lost his commercial driver's license and spent 6 months in a psychiatric facility. He now lives in a small, anonymous town, working a menial job, forever haunted by what he saw that night in the Mojave Desert. He is haunted by the memory of the woman's glowing red eyes and by the image of the faceless man in the long dark coat. Sometimes, late at night, when the air is cold, he thinks he can hear a faint, rhythmic thumping in the distance. And he knows that somewhere out there, on the lonely, dark highways of America, another truck is making a delivery. And he prays for the soul of the driver who is foolish enough to break the seal. For a trucker, a new rig is more than just a machine. It's a new lease on life. After years of driving beat-up, second-hand trucks for other companies, Samuel Sam Jones had finally saved enough to buy his own. It was a beautiful, slightly used Kenworth W900, a classic long nose with gleaming chrome and a deep red paint job. He'd bought it from the widow of another owner-operator who had recently passed away. The woman had been eager to sell, and Sam had gotten a fantastic deal. The truck was his pride and joy, a rolling testament to his hard work and dedication. The previous owner, a man named Elias Thorne, had left a few personal items in the truck. His widow, a frail, sad-eyed woman, had told Sam to keep or discard them as he saw fit. Most of it was junk old maps, greasy tools, a collection of faded paperback novels. But there was one item in the spacious sleeper cab that caught Sam's attention. Tucked into a corner and secured with bungee cords was a small, beautifully crafted wooden rocking chair, sized for a child. It was an antique, made of dark, polished cherry wood with intricate carvings on the backrest. It seemed like a strange thing for a long-haul trucker to carry. But Sam, who had a young daughter of his own, found it oddly charming. He decided to keep it, thinking it added a touch of warmth to the otherwise sterile cab. His first long-haul run in the new truck was a cross-country trip from Portland, Oregon to Atlanta, Georgia. The Kenworth ran like a dream, its powerful engine eating up the miles. Sam felt a sense of freedom and pride he had never known before. He was his own boss, on his own schedule, in his own rig. The first strange occurrence happened on the third night of his journey, somewhere on a desolate stretch of I-80 inches Wyoming. Sam had pulled over at a rest stop to get a few hours of sleep. He was lying in the sleeper berth, drifting into a light slumber, when he heard a soft, rhythmic sound. Creak, 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 asterisk, it was the sound of a wooden rocking chair, gently rocking back and forth. Sam's eyes snapped open. He lay perfectly still, his ears straining in the darkness of the cab. The sound was unmistakable. It was coming from the corner where the small cherry wood chair was secured. He slowly sat up and peered into the darkness. The chair was motionless, held firmly in place by the bungee cords he had checked himself that morning. The sound had stopped. He dismissed it as his mind playing tricks on him. He was tired, and new trucks always made strange noises that you had to get used to. He lay back down, and eventually, exhaustion won out over his unease, and he fell asleep. The next night, it happened again. This time, he was driving through Nebraska, the highway a straight, hypnotic line through an endless sea of cornfields. It was late, around 3 a.m., the hour when the world feels thin and unreal. Over the drone of his engine, he heard it again. Creak, 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 asterisk. He glanced in the small mirror that gave him a view of the sleeper cab. His blood turned to ice. In the dim, ambient light from the dashboard, he could see the small rocking chair moving. It was rocking back and forth, slowly and deliberately, straining against the bungee cords that were supposed to be holding it still. Sam slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. He pulled the truck onto the shoulder, the sudden silence of the cab deafening. He turned around, his eyes wide with disbelief. The chair was perfectly still again. He reached out a trembling hand and touched it. The wood was cold, unnaturally cold. He tried to find a rational explanation. A vibration from the engine? A draft? Nothing made sense. A chair that size, secured that tightly, should not be able to move on its own. Deeply shaken, Sam considered getting rid of the chair at the next truck stop, but a strange, protective feeling came over him. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, and it had belonged to the man who had loved this truck before him. Throwing it away felt disrespectful. He told himself, again, that he was just tired, that his mind was playing tricks on him. He continued his journey, but the fear was now a constant, unwelcome passenger. The rocking would start every night, always in the darkest, most isolated hours. Sometimes it would happen while he was driving, a gentle, mocking rhythm from the corner of his eye. Other times, it would wake him from a dead sleep, the slow, deliberate creaking filling the small cab with a sense of unbearable dread. One night, parked at a truck stop in Missouri, the creaking was joined by a new sound. It was a faint, melodic humming, the sound of a child humming a simple, familiar lullaby. The sound was so clear, so close, it was as if a small child were sitting right there in the cab with him. Sam bolted upright, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He aimed it at the chair. It was empty, rocking gently. The humming stopped the instant the light hit it. Sam couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, he called the widow of the previous owner. He felt foolish, but he had to know. After exchanging pleasantries, he cautiously asked about the small rocking chair. "Oh, that old thing," the woman said, her voice suddenly soft and filled with a deep sadness. "That was Elias's. Well, he called it his co-pilot." "His co-pilot?" Sam asked. The woman hesitated, then sighed. "Elias and we had a daughter. Lily. She passed away when she was just 5 years old, a terrible fever. That little chair was hers. It was her favorite. After she was gone, Elias couldn't bear to part with it, he said. He said he felt like she was still with him when he had it in the truck. He said he could sometimes hear her humming, especially on the long, lonely nights. He said it brought him comfort." Sam felt a profound chill seep into his bones. This wasn't a malicious haunting. It was the lingering spirit of a little girl, attached to her favorite possession, still riding the highways with her father. "He told me a strange thing once," the widow continued, her voice trembling slightly. "He said that as long as Lily was with him, nothing bad could ever happen on the road. He said she was his guardian angel." Sam didn't know what to say. He thanked the woman for her time and hung up, his mind reeling. He looked at the small, empty chair in the corner of his cab. It no longer seemed menacing. It seemed tragic. That night, as he drove through the rolling hills of Tennessee, the rocking started again. Creak, creak, creak. Asterisk. It was soon followed by the soft, gentle humming of the lullaby. But this time, Sam wasn't afraid. He felt a strange sense of peace, of shared guardianship. "Hello, Lily," he whispered into the quiet of the cab. "It's a long road tonight. I'm glad for the company." The humming seemed to grow just a little bit louder, a little more content. A few hours later, as Sam was navigating a sharp, downhill curve, his front right tire blew out with a deafening explosion. The truck lurched violently, pulling him toward the guardrail and the steep, rocky embankment beyond it. It was the kind of blowout that should have been catastrophic, the kind that sends a rig jackknifing into oncoming traffic or tumbling over a cliff. Sam wrestled with the wheel, his muscles straining, but he knew he was losing the fight. The truck was going to go over. He closed his eyes, bracing for the impact. Suddenly, he felt a strange sensation. It felt as if a small, gentle pressure was being applied to the steering wheel, counteracting his own frantic movements, guiding the truck. The violent pull toward the guardrail lessened, and he was able to slowly, miraculously, bring the massive, crippled rig to a safe stop on the shoulder. He sat there for a long time, his body trembling with adrenaline, his heart pounding. He had survived. He shouldn't have, but he had. He turned his head and looked into the sleeper cab. The small, cherrywood rocking chair was perfectly still, But sitting in the chair, for just a fleeting second, he saw her. It was the faint, translucent image of a little girl with blonde curls and a bright, smiling face. She looked at him, and then she faded away like smoke. Sam never tried to get rid of the rocking chair. It remained his co-pilot for the rest of his trucking career. The gentle rocking and the soft humming continued to be a regular occurrence on his nightly runs, but they were no longer a source of fear. They were a comfort, a reminder that he was not alone, that he had a small guardian angel watching over him from the corner of his cab. He learned that some spirits don't linger to haunt or to terrify, but to protect. And on the long, dark, and often dangerous highways of America, sometimes a trucker needs all the protection he can get, even if it comes from the ghost of a little girl in a small, wooden rocking chair. Vernon Blake was a man who lived by the clock. In his 13 years of hauling high-value freight across the mid-Atlantic states, his reputation had been built on two things: meticulous safety protocols and unwavering punctuality. He was known among regional truckers for his calm professionalism and his willingness to share precise, real-time road information. His life was a carefully managed symphony of logbooks, dispatch schedules, and estimated times of arrival. For Vernon, there was a right way to do things, and the right way was always on time. That particular April evening, Vernon was hauling a critical load of pharmaceutical products from a depot in Richmond, Virginia, to a distribution center in Charleston, West Virginia. The cargo required a constant, controlled temperature and careful handling to prevent any damage to the life-saving medications. Vernon took a special pride in these pharmaceutical runs. He knew that a delay on his part could have real-world consequences for patients waiting for essential treatments. The stretch of Interstate 77 through the mountains of southern Virginia was familiar territory. It was a challenging route, known for its steep grades, sharp, winding curves, and the unpredictable weather patterns that could sweep through the Blue Ridge Mountains without warning. During the spring months, sudden, violent thunderstorms could transform a routine drive into a treacherous ordeal. Vernon was approaching the small community of Hillsville, his rig purring along exactly on schedule, when his CB radio crackled to life with a transmission that immediately seized his full attention. The voice was startlingly clear, professional, and delivered with a calm precision that was unnerving. But the most chilling part was that the voice was, unmistakably, his own. Northbound pharmaceutical hauler at mile marker 78, the voice said, a perfect echo of his own accent and cadence. This is your future self, calling from tomorrow morning at 6:30 hours. You need to exit immediately at Route 58 and take the alternate route through Stewart. I repeat, do not continue on Interstate 77 past mile marker 85. Vernon felt a cold electric shock jolt through his body. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The transmission had identified him, his cargo, and his exact location with impossible accuracy, and the claim was insane. His future self? He fumbled for his microphone, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. Unknown station. This is the northbound pharmaceutical hauler. He transmitted, his voice tight and strained. Identify yourself. Is this some kind of joke? The response came instantly, and the voice on the other end was filled with a desperate, raw urgency that made the hair on Vernon's arms stand up. It was his voice, but it was ragged, exhausted, and laced with a trauma he had never known. Vernon, listen to me. This is not a joke. At mile marker 85, there is going to be a catastrophic bridge collapse. It will be caused by a propane truck explosion. The accident will occur at exactly 22:47 hours, 22:47, which is exactly 37 minutes from your current time. If you continue on this route, you will be directly on the bridge when it happens. You will not survive. Vernon's mind reeled. He glanced at the digital clock on his dashboard. The time was 22:10. He checked his GPS. Mile marker 85 was approximately 7 miles ahead. At his current speed, he would reach that location in just over 30 minutes. The timeline was terrifyingly precise. "This is impossible," Vernon whispered into the microphone. "How can you be speaking to me from the future?" The voice on the other end sighed, a sound filled with a weary, heartbreaking resignation. "I don't know how it works, Vernon. All I know is that I'm lying in a hospital bed at Roanoke Memorial. I'm being treated for severe burns and multiple fractures. I lived through the collapse, but just barely. 3 other drivers. They died instantly when the propane truck went up. I remember this exact conversation from 12 hours ago. I remember hearing my own warning, and I remember choosing to ignore it because it sounded crazy. I am calling you, calling back through time to give you the chance I didn't take." The idea was preposterous, a violation of every law of physics, Vernon understood. And yet, the voice, it was his time's voice. "Prove it," Vernon demanded, his voice shaking. "Tell me something only I would know." The response came without hesitation, and the words struck him like a physical blow. "In your wallet, behind your commercial driver's license, you keep a photograph of your daughter, Sarah, at her high school graduation. On the back, you wrote the words, 'I am proud of you,' every day in blue ink. You look at it every morning before you start your shift." Vernon felt the air leave his lungs. It was true. Every detail was true. It was a private, sacred ritual he had never shared with another living soul. "You also have a small, crescent-shaped scar on your left wrist," the voice continued, its tone relentless. "You got it when you were 8 years old, when you fell through a glass door at your grandmother's house. You tell people you got it from a work injury because you're embarrassed about the real story." Vernon unconsciously touched his left wrist, his fingers tracing the familiar, raised tissue of the old scar. The description was perfect. No one, not even his wife, knew the true origin of that scar. He was beginning to believe. "Vernon, I need you to listen very carefully," the voice from the future said, its urgency mounting. "I'm going to tell you the sequence of events. In approximately 15 minutes, you will see a red propane tanker truck entering Interstate 77 from the Route 52 on-ramp. The driver is having a heart attack. He will lose consciousness at the wheel. His truck will veer across all lanes of traffic and strike the main support pillar of the bridge at high speed." Vernon checked his watch again, his mind now working with a cold, terrified clarity. He would watch for the red propane truck. If it appeared as predicted, he would have his proof. "The explosion will be massive," the voice continued, the pain and memory raw in its tone. "It will destabilize the entire bridge structure. The main span will collapse within seconds, dropping several vehicles, including yours, into the river below. Emergency response will take over an hour to reach the scene because the collapse will block access from both directions." Vernon was now approaching the exit for Route 58, the alternate route his future self had recommended. The green sign loomed in his headlights, a crossroads in his destiny. The decision he made in the next few minutes would determine everything. He could trust his lifetime of logic and punctuality and continue on his scheduled route, or he could trust the impossible voice on the radio and take the detour, adding 2 hours to his delivery time but potentially saving his life. Exactly 15 minutes after receiving the warning, Vernon saw it. A set of headlights was merging onto the highway from the Route 52 on-ramp ahead. As the vehicle came into view under the highway lights, he saw that it was a large, red commercial tanker truck. And displayed on its side, clear as day, were the hazardous materials placards for flammable gas. It was a propane truck. As it merged onto the interstate, Vernon watched with a growing sense of horror as the truck began to weave slightly, drifting from one side of its lane to the other, the unmistakable sign of a driver in medical distress or falling asleep at the wheel. That was all the proof Vernon needed. He wrenched the steering wheel to the right, taking the Route 58 exit so sharply that his tires squealed in protest. He began the longer, slower journey through the winding mountain roads of Stewart, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. As he drove, he kept his CB radio on, his hand hovering over the volume knob, listening for any news from the interstate he had just abandoned. At exactly 22:47, the radio, which had been quiet, erupted into chaos. "Mayday! Mayday on I-77! There's been an explosion! The bridge! My God, the whole bridge is gone! There's fire everywhere! A truck exploded on the bridge at mile marker 85. The whole thing just fell into the river. Stay back! Stay back! The whole highway is blocked. There are cars in the water." Vernon pulled his truck over to the side of the dark mountain road and listened to the frantic, terrified voices of his fellow truckers. He sat in the silence of his cab, the emergency chatter on the radio, a testament to the disaster he had just narrowly avoided. He was 2 hours behind schedule, but he was alive. He completed his delivery to Charleston, arriving late but safe. The story of the bridge collapse was all over the news. The details were exactly as the voice on the radio had predicted. The propane truck driver had suffered a fatal heart attack. The explosion had been catastrophic. 3 truck drivers and 2 passenger vehicles had plunged into the river. There were no survivors from the bridge itself. Vernon never received another transmission from his future self. He never told anyone the full story, knowing it would be dismissed as a hallucination, a product of stress and a lonely road. But he knew what had happened. He knew that for a few terrifying minutes, the normal laws of time and causality had been suspended. He knew that somehow, through a mechanism he would never understand, his own dying self had reached back across 12 hours of time to prevent a tragedy that, in another timeline, had already occurred. Vernon finished his trucking career without ever experiencing another temporal anomaly. But he never again dismissed a strange voice on the radio or an unexplainable feeling. He had learned that the highways held mysteries far deeper than most people could ever imagine. Mysteries that connected the past, the present, and the future in ways that defied all rational explanation. The bridge on Interstate 77 was eventually rebuilt, but Vernon never drove that route again. He always took the longer way around, the winding mountain roads that had saved his life on the night he chose to believe a warning from tomorrow. Diane and Michael Foster were a team, in life and on the road. For 7 years, they had operated as a husband and wife driving team, a rarity in the solitary world of long-haul trucking. They shared the driving, the maintenance, the logbooks, and the loneliness, their partnership making the endless miles bearable. They specialized in hauling high-value electronics from the tech hubs of California to distribution centers throughout Oregon and Washington, their reliability and professionalism earning them a steady stream of lucrative contracts. That particular September evening, they were hauling a load of computer components from San Jose to Portland, running slightly ahead of schedule. Michael had just finished his driving shift and was now resting in the sleeper berth, leaving Diane at the wheel. She was navigating their rig through the majestic Columbia River Gorge, one of the most scenic and treacherous sections of Interstate 84. The highway snaked along the edge of the massive Columbia River, through a dramatic canyon carved by millions of years of water erosion. The landscape was breathtaking, almost otherworldly in its raw, natural beauty. Diane loved this part of the drive, especially during the evening hours when the setting sun would paint the towering canyon walls in brilliant, fiery shades of orange and red. The route was challenging, with its steep grades and powerful, unpredictable crosswinds that could buffet the truck without warning, but the spectacular scenery made the extra effort worthwhile. She had driven this section of highway hundreds of times and prided herself on knowing the location of every rest area, scenic overlook, and truck-friendly fuel stop. It was approaching 11 o'clock, the sky now a deep, star-dusted indigo, when Diane noticed signs for a rest area she did not remember ever seeing before. The familiar blue rectangular signs appeared at the standard intervals, indicating restroom facilities, picnic tables, and parking for both commercial and passenger vehicles. But the name on the sign, Columbia Gorge Scenic Rest Area, was unfamiliar. Diane's internal map of this route was flawless, and this place was not on it. Still, she needed to take her mandatory break, and the timing was perfect. The appearance of a new, seemingly well-maintained facility was a welcome surprise. She activated her turn signal and began to reduce her speed, guiding the massive truck onto the exit ramp. The rest area appeared to be modern and properly lit, a small island of civilization in the vast, dark wilderness of the gorge. As she pulled into the parking area, she realized this was no ordinary rest stop. It was larger and far more elaborate than any other facility on I-84. Instead of the typical Spartan, concrete block buildings, this location featured extensive, beautifully manicured landscaping, multiple covered pavilions with picnic tables, and a large, modern visitor center that looked more like a national park headquarters than a standard highway rest stop. The parking areas were spacious and well-designed, with clearly marked, separate sections for commercial vehicles, passenger cars, and RVs. Diane parked the truck in the commercial vehicles section and, after a quick, quiet check on the sleeping Michael, she stepped out into the cool night air. She noticed that several other travelers were using the facility, though there was something strange about them. She saw families with young children who should have been asleep at this late hour, playing quietly on the grass. She saw elderly couples strolling leisurely through the landscaped gardens and groups of young people who appeared to be on a relaxed vacation, despite the fact that it was a Tuesday evening in September. A sense of unease began to creep over her as she walked toward the restroom facilities. She started to notice details that seemed off, dissonant. The architectural style of the buildings was inconsistent. Some structures looked like they were from the 1962, with clean, modernist lines, while others looked much more recent, with glass and steel construction. The landscaping itself was bizarre. It included plants and trees from vastly different climates, species that should not have been able to survive, let alone thrive, side by side in the specific climate of the Columbia River Gorge. Drawn by a strange curiosity, Diane entered the main visitor center. The interior was bright, clean, and utterly silent. The walls were lined with historical displays about the Columbia River Gorge, but as she examined them, her unease intensified into a cold, prickling dread. The exhibits described the history of the area, but they included events and dates that spanned over 100 years, presented as if they were all part of a single, continuous present. One display case contained pioneer artifacts from the 1890s. Another featured black and white photographs from the construction of the Bonneville Dam in the 1930s. A third exhibit, complete with a grainy color video on a loop, discussed the dedication of Interstate 84 inches, the 1960. And a fourth, on a sleek, futuristic touchscreen display, detailed environmental conservation efforts and future development plans for the area, with dates stretching 20 years into her future. It was as if the rest area existed simultaneously in multiple time periods. Behind an information desk, a pleasant-looking woman in her 40s was reading a magazine. She looked up as Diane approached, her smile filled with a genuine warmth that was almost unnerving. "Welcome to the Columbia Gorge Rest Area," the attendant said, her voice soft and calm. "I'm Sarah. I hope you're enjoying your visit. Is there anything I can help you find?" Diane looked more closely at the woman and realized that her clothing and hairstyle were subtly wrong. She was wearing a style of dress and had her hair done in a way that would have been fashionable in the late 1970s or early 1980s. "I was just wondering about the history of this place," Diane said, her voice hesitant. "When was it built?" Sarah smiled, a patient, knowing smile. She consulted a thick, leather-bound binder on the desk that looked like an old logbook. "That's an interesting question," she said. "According to our records, this facility has been serving travelers since 1923, though it has been expanded and renovated many times over the years." Diane knew this was impossible. Interstate 84 hadn't been constructed until the 1960s. The location where they were standing had been inaccessible, untamed wilderness in 1923. Yet, Sarah appeared to be completely sincere. and the binder she was referencing looked authentic, its pages yellowed with age. "What year is it now?" Diane asked, the question feeling absurd as it left her lips. Sarah checked a calendar on her desk. It was a simple, paper calendar displaying the month of September 1987. "It's 1987, of course," she said kindly. "Though we get visitors from many different time periods here, so I can understand if you're a little confused about the date." A profound chill ran down Diane's spine. She had stumbled into a place that existed outside of normal time. The other travelers, she had seen the families, the couples, the young people. They weren't just unusual night owls. They were people from different eras, all temporarily gathered at this impossible, interdimensional way station. Diane walked back outside, her heart pounding. She observed the other visitors more carefully now. A family with young children was having a picnic, and their station wagon, parked nearby, was a model from the 1962. An elderly couple sat on a bench, and their formal attire and the way they spoke suggested they might be from an even earlier time. Most disturbing of all was a group of young people who were looking at handheld devices that were thin, transparent sheets of glass, discussing technological and political events that had not yet happened in Diane's timeline. They were travelers from her future. A wave of panic washed over her. She had to get Michael. She had to get them out of here. She ran back to her truck and pulled open the passenger door, ready to shake her husband awake. But when she entered the cab and pulled back the curtain to the sleeper berth, she found it empty. Michael was gone. His personal belongings were still there, his wallet on the small counter, his favorite jacket folded neatly, the book he was reading lying face down. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that he had left the truck for any reason. He had simply vanished. Diane searched the entire rest area, her panic rising to a frantic crescendo. She ran through the gardens, checked every stall in the restrooms, and circled the visitor center, calling his name. The other visitors watched her with a placid, detached curiosity, but no one offered to help. It was as if her distress was a foreign concept to them. A man in his 60s, wearing a suit and tie that looked like they were from the 1952, approached her with a sympathetic expression. "Are you looking for someone, my dear?" he asked, his voice gentle. "People sometimes get separated here. Time, it moves differently for different visitors." "What do you mean, it moves differently?" Diane asked, her voice trembling with fear. "This place," the man explained patiently, as if he had given this explanation many times before. "It exists in a space between the seconds. Some people arrive from the past, some from the future. The amount of time you spend here, it may not match the time that passes in your own world. Your husband may have just stepped away for a moment in his time, but that moment could be hours or days in yours." Diane realized with a surge of pure terror that she might be trapped. This place wasn't a sanctuary, it was a trap, a temporal anomaly that collected travelers from different eras, holding them in a timeless, inescapable prison. She had to leave. Now, even if it meant leaving Michael behind, she ran back toward the parking lot, intending to get in her truck and drive away, to somehow force her way back into her own time. But as she approached the spot where the entrance ramp had connected to Interstate 84, she saw that the road was gone. Where the access road should have been, there was now only a dense, ancient forest that looked as if it had been undisturbed for centuries. The highway itself was no longer visible. The constant, familiar sound of traffic had been replaced by the deep, profound silence of the wilderness. Diane was trapped. She spent what felt like hours, or perhaps days, walking the perimeter of the rest area, looking for any sign of an exit, any seam in the fabric of this impossible reality. The other visitors seemed content, living in a timeless loop, their conversations never changing, their activities repeating in an endless cycle. Just as she was about to give in to despair, as the first light of a sun that seemed neither to rise nor set began to glow, she noticed the landscape changing. The dense forest at the edge of the rest area began to thin, becoming translucent. She could hear the faint, distant sound of traffic, a sound that grew steadily louder. The access road began to slowly rematerialize, its asphalt shimmering into existence, connecting the rest area back to the highway. She ran toward her truck. Through the windshield, she could see Michael, sitting up in the driver's seat, stretching as if he were just waking up from a normal rest period. Diane sprinted to the truck and scrambled into the passenger seat, her body shaking. Michael looked at her, a look of mild surprise on his face. He glanced at his watch. "Hey, you're back just in time," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "How was your break? You look like you've seen a ghost." Diane looked back at the rest area. It was fading rapidly, the elaborate buildings and manicured gardens becoming transparent, dissolving like a mirage in the desert heat. Within moments, it had vanished completely, leaving only an empty, scrub-covered patch of land beside the highway. I'm not sure what happened," Diane answered, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I think I might have been dreaming." They completed their delivery to Portland on schedule. But Diane was never the same. She obsessively researched the history of I-84 and the Columbia River Gorge, but she found no official record of any rest area at that location. There was no evidence that such a facility had ever existed. However, she did find scattered, unofficial reports from other travelers, posted on obscure internet forums and in old, forgotten books of local lore. The accounts dated back decades, and they all described a mysterious, beautiful rest area that would appear and disappear without warning along that same stretch of I-84. They all described a place where time did not follow its normal rules, a place where visitors from different eras could briefly cross paths. And some of the stories contained a chilling, recurring warning. Be careful who you travel with, because sometimes the rest area keeps a souvenir. Diane never saw the interdimensional rest area again, though she and Michael continued to drive that route for the rest of their careers. But she never stopped searching for it. On every trip through the gorge, her eyes would scan the roadside, hoping to see the familiar blue sign, hoping for a chance to go back. Because while Diane had managed to escape, she knew, with a certainty that haunted her every waking moment, that the man sitting beside her, the man who looked and sounded and acted exactly like her husband, was not the same Michael who had gone to sleep in the sleeper berth that night. Something was different. Something was missing from his eyes. And she knew that the real Michael was still back there, in that beautiful, impossible place, a permanent resident of the rest area that wasn't there, lost somewhere between the seconds.